Today's question is a very common one. How do I learn everything for the exam? Well, exams are a common cause of stress, and I think that one of the reasons is that the curriculum at university, unlike at school, is very open-ended. There isn't a finite, definitive list of all the things that you have to learn, just a suggested starting point. You're expected to read around on top of the material covered in lectures, so there's no end point where you can say, I have learned everything and I can stop now. It can feel unmanageable and overwhelming. Anything could and might come up in the exam, so how can you prepare for that? So there really is a limit to how much you can realistically learn, that you can be expected to learn. And just because in theory, with an open-ended curriculum, if it's relevant, you could include anything in an exam, that doesn't mean that you have to learn everything just in case. One of the keys to doing well in exams is understanding what's really being tested, what exams are for, being selective about what you learn, and thinking about how and why you select it for that purpose. What's often behind the stress, this perception that you need to learn everything, is that we're not actually clear on what exams test and how that's different to other forms of assessment, such as coursework. And we're not clear what the expectations are that we're trying to meet. We try and hold ourselves to the same standard that we'd expect when we're working on a piece of coursework, because at least that's a standard that's familiar and that we know, and exams are the unknown, which is kind of the point of them. This is true even of take-home exam papers. Although you often have a longer time period, 24 hours for example, you're still not expected to learn everything or research everything within that time frame as you would with coursework. You're working with information that's already to hand and familiar, largely what's in your head. There are differences between subjects. If you're studying the physical or medical sciences, for example, there is, especially in the first years, an emphasis on memorization and understanding of key information, and a bit less on the kind of open-ended analytical thinking that you'd find in arts and humanities subjects, where it's less about learning core facts and more about building arguments. But certainly in the higher stages of a degree, there's less difference. So let me give you an analogy to help illustrate the difference between expectations for coursework and for exams. So coursework, whether it's a report or an essay or a dissertation or other piece of writing, is like giving a dinner party. You know in good time that you're going to throw a dinner party for your friends, and you can fix a lot of things in advance. Which friends you're going to invite, how many people, what they like, what they can't eat, for example. You then have time to do some research in your cookbooks or online recipe blogs to decide what the menu's going to be, find just the right recipe. You can spend time sourcing the right ingredients in all the different places. You can go to the deli, to the posh supermarket, that specialist shop that you found, and you can plan how you're going to approach it. Practice any techniques and make sure that everything's prepared on the day. Your guests expect you to go to that extra effort and put in that work to make it a bit special for them. Now, you don't throw dinner parties that often, and even if you did, you'd probably not cook that exact same meal again for those same people. So chances are the ingredients that you bought might not get used again that much. They're quite specialist for a particular recipe for a special occasion, and that's okay. You might find another use for that particular jar of unusual spices that you bought, or you might not, and it might go quietly out of date at the back of your cupboard. But that's not the point. It was sought out and chosen for a particular purpose, and that's been achieved. You've shown that you can plan, source, and prepare a special meal, and you've impressed your friends. And coursework tests your ability to do just that, to think about how you're going to approach the issue, to find and choose just the right information and knowledge and use it in exactly the right way for that particular task. And if it's a bit unusual or a bit special, well, so much the better. It's an opportunity to show off. And you don't need to memorize or keep all of that information handy. The point is that you were able to find it and use it when you needed it. Now, an exam is much more like an average evening when you're sitting at home and a couple of your friends turn up at your door, or unexpectedly because they were passing, they were in the area, and they thought they'd drop in and say hi. They're also hungry. So your job here is to keep a well-stocked store cupboard of things which you could throw together to give, on an off chance, a couple of options depending on what they fancy, whether one of them's vegetarian or doesn't like spicy foods or whatever. And by well-stocked store cupboard, I don't mean that you've got every possible ingredient in. I mean, you've got the basics. You've got the rice, the pasta, the bread, the tins of tomatoes, maybe some cheese, some onions, peppers, garlic, lentils. Enough things that are potentially the foundation of a meal and could potentially be used in a number of different dishes in different ways. You've also got herbs and spices and other things that could be thrown in there to help you to create those different options and make it tasty and interesting. No one is going to expect a 3-course meal with elaborate ingredients in those circumstances. But with the basics and a few creative options and ideas, you could offer a pasta dish, a curry, or a tasty soup, depending on what's needed. If you still have that jar of spice from that dinner party last month, fine, throw it in there if you think it would work. And that's what exams test. Can you answer questions and problem solve under time pressure with what you have usually to hand? Not everything, but do you have the fundamentals, the essentials, and the skills to throw together a few useful, adaptable things in multiple ways, flexibly, to suit a variety of needs and requirements? So you're responding to whatever challenge you're set on the day. You're not expected to know absolutely everything, no matter how niche or specialist. You're not expected to create perfect, polished and in-depth answers. That wouldn't be realistic under the circumstances, nor would it be a useful thing for us to test. Students often ask us, for example, if they should include references in exams. Well, it might add a bit of interest if you could throw in the names and dates of a couple of relevant or key studies, but there would be little value in us expecting you to memorize the full bibliographic details of references. Why would you need to carry that information around in your head habitually? So when it comes to selecting and managing your revision, you've got 2 starting points. The first, to make sure that you've got the essentials in stock, are the lectures. Those will cover the fundamentals, the essential facts, concepts or techniques that you'll need. When you're going back over lecture recordings and notes though, don't get sucked into trying to remember and revise everything. Try and distinguish what's the core knowledge and what's illustrations, examples, demonstrations, or just interesting asides. If you want to cross-check this, you could map your understanding of the fundamentals with a textbook or a handbook or two, and where the coverage overlaps, that's telling you that those are the essentials. You could also add in anything else that you find in your reading around as that extra spice. There's additional ingredients that you can throw in to adapt your essentials in different ways or give them different flavours to respond to different questions that you're set in the exam. But again, you can't learn everything. The key is to go for things that can be used flexibly in various ways or for different purposes. Your second starting point, and that might give you the reassurance that you've covered the essentials and the kind of extras that you're selecting will actually earn their keep rather than bog you down, is past papers. Try working with past papers right from the start of your revision process. Not to question the spot or predict what will come up this year, that's quite an unreliable strategy, and not to test yourself to see if you have learned something, but as a guide to the kinds of things that are typically called on in exams, as a way to think through how and if you might use a piece of knowledge in an exam. How useful or adaptable or central is it likely to be? What would you need in order to answer that question, bearing in mind the time limit in the exam and the fact that you can only be expected to work with what we can reasonably assume is in your head? If you're wondering whether or not you do need to learn a piece of information or not, you could see if you could potentially use it in more than one question, or whether it's so niche that actually it's unlikely to be an essential or even a useful optional extra in an exam. It's too niche. No past papers for your module? Well, try this. Put yourself in the examiner's shoes and set your own questions. If this was your module and you were the lecturer, what questions would you set to test your students' knowledge of the essentials and also their ability to problem solve creatively under pressure with a time limit and only with what you think it's worth them carrying around in their heads rather than going off and researching. How much would you test? How much depth, how much detail before you could feel that you got a reasonable measure that your students knew their stuff? Would it be worth them learning that knowledge, or is it more the kind of knowledge that they just need to know how to find if they need it for coursework? So when you're revising for exams, and perhaps looking over previous coursework from the module to help you prepare, don't feel that you need to reproduce a coursework standard answer in an exam. Coursework and exams are testing different kinds of learning and expect different kinds of response. You don't have to learn everything.